Give me a mic check.
1, 2. BSD Substance XL 2-piece BMX cranks. Is it crank or cranks? I've never known. I've always said crank because it's one crank. You know, half of it is half of a crank. I'm not going to make it plural for no reason like shorts. Is that good?
No, that's good.
What's up, everybody? It's Rob from the Basement Bike Shop, and today I'm going to show you how to install a 2-piece crank. Now, the crank we're installing is the BSD Substance XL Crank and a Sunday Sabretooth Sprocket. Now, we're going to install this crank in our Mafia frame from the last video where we installed the bottom bracket. If you'd like to watch that video first, you can click on the link, or there'll be a link in the description. So out of the box, we have the 2 arms and spindle. Now, a 2-piece crank is very similar to a 3-piece crank, except for one of the arms is already attached to the spindle. So a lot of these techniques that I use are the same ones I use to install a 3-piece. You just have to install everything from one side. We also have the flush-mounted crank bolt, the sprocket bolt, and the crank arm setting tool, the Sunday Sabretooth Sprocket, and then our cone spacers and micro spacers from our bottom bracket build. The tools we're going to need for this build are the crank arm setting tool that came with the crank, a wrench to turn the crank arm setting tool, a 10mm Allen wrench, a 6mm Allen wrench, a little bit of grease, a block of wood and a hammer, something to measure with, and then something that I can tap the spindle out with. I find that my extension for my sockets fits really good. If you're using a different size spindle, you can put different size sockets on that extension till you get the right size. So the first thing we're going to do is slide our sprocket onto our spindle and snug it down to our right arm. Now, if you're installing this left-hand drive, I still want you to do this step only when we pre-fit it into the frame. I want you to pre-fit it into the other side. So ours fits snug right through. If you're installing a crank of a different size spindle, then you might need the adapter. Now, if you need an adapter, the adapter will go on the back side, and you'll always include it in all your measurements, but nothing should ever sit in between the sprocket and the arm. I'm going to take our sprocket bolt, start threading it in, and then take our 6mm Allen wrench and snug it down. Not too tight. We're going to tighten it up later, but just so it's all the way against the arm. Then we're going to slide on our drive side cone spacer. Now, that is the shorter of the 2 cone spacers, and we're going to put the wider end away from the sprocket. The wider end always goes toward the bearings. And for the pre-fit, that's all we're going to put on it. The next thing I do is pre-fit the crank into the frame with just the sprocket and the drive side cone spacer on. Now, if you're doing this left-hand drive, I want you to slide it in from the left side instead of the right. What we're doing in this step is just measuring to see how many micro spacers we need on the drive side. Then we're going to take our block of wood and our hammer and gently tap the crank all the way through. Make sure your center spacer is lined up before you do this. And all we're going to do is push it to the point where the sprocket doesn't rub, or the arm, or especially the sprocket bolt. Once you get the drive side of your crank positioned exactly where you want it, which is usually as close to the frame as you can get it without anything rubbing, you're going to push the drive side cone spacer against the bearing and then measure the gap in between the drive side cone spacer and the sprocket, or a sprocket adapter if you have one in. How I like to do it is I take my micro spacers and I see what combination it takes to fit and fill that gap, and then I put those aside. Always estimate a little bit bigger if you need to. You never want anything to be rubbing on the frame. So after we have our drive side measurement, we're going to tap out our spindle. Now this is where our socket extension and socket come into play. I found for this one, the 16mm socket fit almost perfect. You don't want to damage the threads, so just tap gently. It is metal on metal. You can put a little piece of wood in there if you'd like, but also just slowly so that the whole crank... Shit. Make sure you always keep your feet clear when you're removing the crank. And now it's time to get our measurement for our non-drive side. Now if you're installing the crank left-hand drive, you can remove the sprocket now for this step. But if you're already going to do it right-hand drive, then there's no need to. But the measurement of the sprocket, the adapter if you have one, all the micro spacers and the cone spacer should be the same measurement between the arm and the bearing on the opposite side. So what we're going to do is take our non-drive side cone spacer and see how many spacers it takes to get the same measurement. I don't have another black one apparently. What I like to do is if I have a large spacer and I have no adapter in, I'm going to put it against the back side of my sprocket. And now it's time for our final install. If you're installing it left-hand drive, this is where you would take the sprocket off and you would take the spacers we decided go on the non-drive side and put those on the right side. But we're installing this right-hand drive, so we'll leave the sprocket on and put on our spacers for the drive side. Then just like the pre-fit, we're going to slide it back in, lining up our center tube spacer with our finger on our other hand, and then tap it in. This time we're going to tap it in all the way until all of our spacers are tight. And then check to make sure that nothing's rubbing the arm or the sprocket bolt especially. And then on to the left side, where we take our non-drive side cone spacer and our other micro spacers that equal the same distance as the other side, and we put them on. And then just check to make sure that the spindle goes about 3/4 of the way through the spline. Now you can see that the bolt is recessed, so the spline doesn't go all the way to the end. Then we'll put a little grease on our spindle. Now if you're doing a left-hand drive install, then you would have your cone spacer and other spacers and sprocket just slid on before you do this. And then you're going to line up your arm. It's easy to have it just a notch off on a 48 spline or more, so take your time, eye it up, make sure you got it on straight. And then once you have it straight, just take a block and a hammer and tap it on just a little bit. This is just so that your tool doesn't strip out the spindle because you don't have enough threads into the spindle. And then you just screw your crank arm setting tool in, take your wrench, tighten it down. Now if you're doing left-hand drive, just before you get tight, you want to put your sprocket bolt in, just snug. We'll tighten it down at the end. Then once you got it tight, remove the tool and put in your bolt. And then tighten it down with a 10mm Allen wrench. Now if you're installing this left-hand drive, there'll be a sprocket right there. Make sure you don't crack your knuckles on it. I've done that plenty of times. And then once you get that tight, we just have to take our 6mm and tighten up our sprocket bolt. Again, make sure you don't crack your knuckles on that sprocket. And that about wraps it up. Thanks for watching. The next video in this series will be the installation of the fork, headset, and stem. If you like what you saw, hit that subscribe button and I'll keep these videos coming. If you have any questions or requests for future videos, you can comment below or you can send me a message. Thanks a lot.